I found her sitting under the buzzing neon of the food court. When I saw my daughter at the mall food court counting coins, I asked, "Where is the car we bought you?" She looked up with hollow eyes and a trembling lip. She said her husband and mother-in-law took her car, her money, and threatened to take her daughter. I felt a cold iron settle in my chest as I grabbed her hand. I just told her, "Don't worry. I will handle this." Her fingers were ice. The smell of cheap grease and sugary pretzels turned my stomach. Sophia tried to pull her hand back, glancing nervously at the mall entrance. Her faded grocery store uniform was stained and 2 sizes too large for her thin frame. She looked like a ghost of the vibrant nurse I had raised. Every time a shadow crossed the tile, she flinched as if expecting a blow. I realized then she was not just broke. She was being hunted by the very people who swore to love her. "Richard needs the SUV for his new business," she whispered into her lukewarm coffee. I knew he was unemployed and had been for months. She told me they moved her into the garage to save on heating bills. My granddaughter, Emma, was kept inside the main house like a bargaining chip. Diane told Sophia she was an unfit mother for working double shifts. The coercion was systematic and perfectly legal on the surface. Sophia reached for a stray penny, her knuckles bruised and raw. I watched her eat a small fry with a frantic, mechanical speed. It was the hunger of someone who did not know when the next meal would come. My decades of legal practice screamed that this was more than a rough patch. This was a domestic heist orchestrated by a cruel woman and a weak man. I took a deep breath and smoothed my skirt. I needed a team and a paper trail to break them. Sophia checked her phone and turned pale at a silent text. "He is coming to get the change," she said, standing up abruptly. Her knees knocked together as she gathered her meager pile of coins. I stood with her. My height dwarfing her slumped shoulders. I reached into my purse and handed her a single $20 bill. I told her to hide it in her shoe where Diane would not look. She nodded once, a sharp and desperate movement. As she walked away, I saw the black SUV pull up to the curb outside. I stayed in the shadows of the cookie shop and watched Richard wait. He did not get out to help her. He simply tapped his ring against the steering wheel with rhythmic, predatory impatience. I pulled out my phone and dialed my old investigator. The game had changed from a family visit to a tactical recovery. I felt the familiar weight of a courtroom battle beginning to stir. Richard looked toward the glass doors, and for a second, our eyes almost met. I drove to the house on Maple Street as the sun dipped low. The white picket fence looked gray in the dying light. My goal was simple: confirm the house was empty. I saw a "for rent" sign stuck in the brown lawn. I parked at the curb and took a steady breath. Richard had told me they lived here. The dark windows and silent porch proved he was lying. A neighbor watched me from behind a heavy curtain. I walked to the front door and peered through the glass. The living room was stripped bare of furniture and life. Only dust motes danced in the fading rays. My daughter had spent years making this place a home. Now it was just a shell generating cash for her captors. Richard was pocketing the rent while Sophia slept on a garage floor. I snapped a photo of the empty space. My phone felt heavy and hot. Next, I drove to Diane's estate in the hills. The driveway was paved with expensive stone and lined with roses. I sat in my car and waited for a sign. At exactly 7, the black SUV turned into the gate. Richard stepped out and walked inside without looking back. He looked comfortable and smug in his borrowed life. He vanished behind the heavy oak door. Then a small movement near the garage caught my eye. The side door of the garage creaked open a few inches. Sophia stepped out into the night air. She was shivering in her thin uniform. She looked toward the main house with a look of pure longing. She was not allowed inside for dinner or warmth. She sat on the cold concrete step and opened a plastic container. She began to eat leftovers with a plastic fork. I realized she was being treated like a stray dog. I grabbed my camera and recorded the scene in silence. The lens captured the air mattress and the flickering heater. It looked like a fire hazard waiting to happen. Sophia suddenly froze and looked toward the street. I ducked down, my heart hammering against my ribs. She shook her head and went back to her meal. I saw a shadow move in the upstairs window. Diane was watching her daughter-in-law from the comfort of her room. I pulled away slowly without turning on my lights. My mind was a whirlwind of statutes and criminal codes. I needed to see my old friend James by morning. He was the best investigator for this kind of filth. I had enough for a civil suit already. But I wanted more than just a settlement. I wanted them to feel the weight of a cell. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I pulled over and read the short message. It was a photo of Emma sleeping on a couch. The caption said that she missed her mommy tonight. It was sent from Richard's phone to Sophia's old line. He was using the child to taunt her even now. I realized then that Richard was not the leader. He was just a tool for Diane's malice. The mother-in-law had already started the paperwork for full custody. I met Margaret in a dim diner at sunrise. She was my sharpest paralegal for 15 years. I handed her the address for the house on Maple Street. "I need property records and every bank statement," I said. She nodded, her eyes reflecting the neon coffee sign. She knew the stakes without me saying a word. We were hunting for a ghost in the machine. Margaret opened her laptop and started typing. The hunt for their paper trail had begun. By noon, Margaret found the first crack in their armor. The house title had been altered 3 months ago. Sophia's name was still there, but a new lien appeared. Richard had borrowed $60,000 against the equity. He used a power of attorney I knew Sophia never signed. My hands shook as I viewed the digital scan. The signature was a clumsy imitation of my daughter's script. It was a blatant act of felony forgery. We moved to the local bank branch next. I used my old credentials to bypass the junior clerks. The manager led us to a private office in the back. He pulled up the joint account history on a wide monitor. I saw a series of massive transfers to an offshore entity. Every paycheck Sophia earned was drained within minutes. of deposit. She was working herself to the bone for nothing. The bank manager looked away in deep shame. The trail led directly to Diane's personal brokerage account. She was using Sophia's sweat to fund her luxury lifestyle. Every dollar for Emma's future was being gambled on stocks. I felt a surge of cold, professional clarity. This was not just a family dispute anymore. It was a sophisticated web of financial elder and domestic abuse. I told Margaret to print every single page. We had enough to bury them both in a deep hole. We sat in the car, surrounded by stacks of paper. Margaret pointed to a final document on the screen. It was a life insurance policy taken out recently. Richard was the beneficiary, but the premium came from Sophia. The policy was massive, far beyond their actual means. It was another forged signature, on a deadly serious document. I realized they were betting on Sophia's total collapse. They wanted her gone, one way or another. I called James to share the new findings. He was stationed outside the garage in the hills. He told me Diane was currently shouting at Sophia. I could hear the muffled rage through his speaker. Sophia was crying, apologizing for a missing $20 bill. I remembered the bill I gave her at the mall. Diane had found the secret cash in her shoe. The pressure was reaching a breaking point for my daughter. "Get to the house," James urged in a low voice. "Diane is packing a suitcase for the child." My heart skipped a beat at the news. They were planning to move Emma across state lines. If they left tonight, the legal battle would take years. I put the car in gear and roared onto the highway. The paper trail was complete, but time was running out. A second unknown number called my phone. I answered the phone with a steady hand. It was the private investigator James. He had spent the night watching the Hill estate. "I have the footage of the locker incident," he said. He had accessed the grocery store security tapes. "I saw Diane enter the break room while Sophia worked the floor. She used a spare key to open the locker. She took $40 and a photo of Emma." Diane smiled at the camera. James sent a second file to my device. It was a clear recording from a hidden mic. I heard Diane's voice, sharp as a razor. She was telling Emma that Sophia was sick. "Your mommy chose the garage because she is bad," Diane said. The child's quiet sobbing broke my heart into pieces. This was documented parental alienation of a minor. It was the final piece for the custody filing. Diane was digging her own grave. I met James at a park near the house. He handed me a high-resolution long lens camera. "Look at the trash from this morning," he said. I scrolled through the digital images on the screen. There were shredded bank documents and a flight itinerary. Richard was planning to fly to Nevada on Friday. He had a one-way ticket booked in his name. He was preparing to abandon his wife and mother. Richard was looking for a solo exit. The coward was planning to leave Diane with the mess. I felt a grim satisfaction at his betrayal. It made the two vulnerable and easy to split. I realized Richard would fold if I offered him safety. He did not love Diane. He only feared her. He was a parasite looking for a new host. I told James to keep the camera focused on Richard. We needed to catch him meeting his travel contact. The pressure was shifting. We watched the front gate from a hidden van. Richard emerged carrying a heavy leather duffel bag. He looked over his shoulder twice before starting the SUV. He drove toward a motel on the edge of town. I followed at a distance, keeping two cars between us. He met a woman in a bright red dress. They exchanged a thick envelope and a long kiss. Richard was using Sophia's stolen money for a mistress. The mistress handed him a set of car keys. It was a new sedan with out-of-state plates. Richard was swapping vehicles to evade any local trackers. He thought he was being clever and untraceable. I took photos of the license plate and the exchange. This was evidence of further dissipation of marital assets. He was literally driving away with Sophia's future. I felt a cold surge of predatory energy. The hunt was almost over. I called my attorney, Catherine, with the news. She was already drafting the emergency ex parte motion. "We have enough to freeze every account tonight," she said. I told her about the mistress and the Nevada flight. Catherine laughed, a sound like dry autumn leaves. She said the judge would despise a fleeing father. We were going to hit them with everything at once. Then my phone buzzed with an alert from the garage. I found Sophia at the food court again on Tuesday. The air smelled of burnt grease and industrial cleaner. She looked worse than our last meeting. Her skin was a sickly gray under the harsh fluorescent lights. I sat down and pushed a full plate toward her. "Eat every bite," I commanded in my firmest voice. She flinched but obeyed, her hands shaking as she held the fork. She was a woman drowning in plain sight. I opened my leather folder and showed her the photos. I had images of the garage and the mistress. Her eyes widened as she saw Richard with the other woman. The betrayal was a physical blow that left her breathless. "He is leaving for Nevada on Friday," I said softly. I explained the offshore accounts and the forged signatures. She dropped her fork, the clatter echoing against the tile. The truth was finally louder than her fear. Sophia wiped a stray tear with a frayed sleeve. She told me Diane had taken her winter coat. It was a punishment for being disrespectful during a morning lecture. The garage was dropping to 50 degrees at night. I felt a surge of murderous rage behind my ribs. I had to remind myself to be a lawyer first. I needed her to hold on for 3 more days. Justice was a slow blade, but it was sharp. I handed her a small, burner cell phone. "Hide this in your locker at work," I instructed. We needed a way to communicate that Diane could not track. Sophia tucked the device into the waistband of her pants. She looked like a soldier preparing for a suicide mission. I told her the emergency custody papers were ready. We just needed her to survive the week. She nodded, her jaw finally setting with a grim resolve. The mall speakers played a cheerful pop song. It felt like a mockery of our dark reality. I watched Sophia stand up and straighten her uniform. She was terrified, but the flickering hope was visible now. She was no longer fighting this war by herself. I promised her that Emma would be home soon. We were going to reclaim every cent they stole. She walked toward the exit without looking back. She was stronger than she believed. I drove to Catherine's office to sign the final motions. The lobby was quiet, smelling of expensive paper and cedar. We reviewed the timeline for the Friday morning ambush. Every detail was locked into a lethal legal sequence. We had the bank records, the PI footage, and the witness. The judge would have no choice but to act. I felt the weight of the briefcase in my hand. It was a weapon of war. As I left the office, a black sedan followed me. It was the same car Richard's mistress had provided. Someone was watching me from behind the tinted glass. I realized the antagonists were not as oblivious as I thought. They were starting to sense the net closing in. I led the car away from my home. I needed to keep them distracted for 48 hours. Then, my phone buzzed with an alert from James. Friday morning arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum. I picked Sophia up at a gas station near her work. She wore a black dress that hung loose on her frame. She looked like a ghost ready to haunt her own life. We drove to the courthouse in a heavy, charged silence. My hands were steady on the leather steering wheel. I could feel the weight of the evidence folder on my lap. Today was for the reckoning. In the hallway, we saw Richard and Diane with a young lawyer. Richard looked startled to see Sophia with high-level legal counsel. Diane stood tall and wore a string of fake pearls. She tried to sneer at me, but her eyes were twitching. Their lawyer looked at our team and turned a pale shade of gray. He knew he was outmatched before a single word was spoken. We filed into a small, private conference room. The air inside felt thin and cold. Catherine opened the meeting by slamming the file onto the wood. She did not waste time with pleasantries or legal jargon. She laid out the photos of the garage air mattress first. Diane opened her mouth to argue, but the sound died. Next came the bank records showing the offshore transfers and fraud. The room went silent as the forgery evidence hit the table. Richard looked at the floor while his hands began to shake. He looked small and utterly broken. "We have video of the locker theft," I said coldly. I looked Diane in the eye and watched her crumble. I showed the PI footage of her alienating my granddaughter. She tried to claim she was just protecting the child. Catherine interrupted her with a summary of the Nevada flight plan. Richard gasped and looked at Diane with a look of terror. He realized we knew about his secret plan to flee. The alliance between them fractured in an instant. Diane turned on Richard with a snarl of pure venom. She accused him of being weak and ruining their plan. Richard shouted back that she was the one who stole. Their lawyer put his head in his hands in despair. The facade of a happy family had completely burned away. I watched the spectacle with a feeling of grim satisfaction. They were devouring each other to save their own skin. It was a pathetic sight to behold in the light. "You can sign the settlement or face the police," Catherine said. She pushed a stack of legal documents toward the center. The terms were absolute and left them with nothing left. Sophia would get the house, the money, and full custody. Richard would have supervised visits if he finished intensive therapy. Diane would be banned from all contact with the child. It was a total surrender disguised as a civil agreement. The clock on the wall ticked like a ticking bomb. Richard reached for the pen with a trembling, sweaty hand. Diane tried to grab his arm to stop the motion. He pushed her away and signed his name in ink. He was choosing his freedom over his mother's pride today. Diane screamed a curse that echoed through the closed door. She realized she had lost her grip on the money. The lawyer witnessed the signatures and gathered his empty brief. It was over in a matter of a few minutes. We walked out of the room as the victors. Sophia was crying. But these were tears of pure relief. She leaned against the marble wall to catch her breath. We had the signed orders and the power of law. Now we had to go get Emma from the house. I called the local precinct to request a police escort. We needed the uniforms to ensure a peaceful, final transition. The sun finally broke through the heavy morning clouds above. The drive to Diane's estate felt like a victory lap. 2 patrol cars followed us with their lights flashing bright. We pulled into the driveway and blocked the black SUV. I saw Emma looking out from the large front window. She was holding a tattered teddy bear against her chest. Sophia jumped out of the car before I could stop. She ran toward the door with a desperate, motherly speed. The locks clicked open as the officers stepped onto the porch. The door opened and Diane stood there with a suitcase. She tried to make one final plea to the officers. They ignored her and handed the custody order to her. Sophia scooped Emma into her arms and held her tight. The child began to laugh and cry at the same time. It was a beautiful and heartbreaking sound in the air. Then I saw a man in a suit watching from the street. He was not with our team, or the police. The man in the suit stepped closer to the property line. He held a leather folio and watched the officers work. I kept my hand on Sophia's shoulder as she hugged Emma. The air felt heavy with the scent of cut grass. Diane was shouting inside the foyer about her stolen rights. I ignored her and focused on the stranger in the street. He looked professional, perhaps a process server or an investigator. He nodded toward me with a sharp, knowing look in his wary eyes. We began loading Sophia's few belongings from the damp garage. The officers stood guard as the air mattress was deflated. I felt a pang of sorrow seeing her life in bins. This cement floor had been her home for far too long. Emma clutched her mother's hand and refused to let go. We were moving with a frantic, desperate speed to leave. The sun hit the stone driveway with a sudden, blinding flash. Diane watched us from the porch with a frozen, hateful expression. The man in the suit finally approached the lead officer. He handed over a thick stack of blue legal papers. "I have a supplemental order for the house on Maple," he said. My heart skipped a beat as I stepped forward to listen. He was a representative from the county sheriff's civil division. He had been sent to serve an immediate eviction notice. It was not for Sophia, but for the illegal tenants. Richard had rented the house to a group of local criminals. The power balance shifted once again in the quiet afternoon. Richard's greed had created a dangerous mess for the family. He had leased the marital home to people who used it. The sheriff explained that the house was now a crime scene. We could not return home tonight, as we had planned. Sophia looked at me with a face full of fresh fear. I realized our victory was incomplete, and still very fragile. We had the child, but we had no safe harbor. I told the officers we would go to a hotel. Diane laughed from the porch, a sound of pure malice. "You have nowhere to sleep tonight," she mocked with glee. I turned and looked her in the eye one last time. "She has her mother," I said with a quiet strength. We bundled Emma into the car and locked the heavy doors. The man in the suit watched us drive away in silence. He looked like he had more bad news to deliver soon. We checked into a quiet suite near the downtown district. The room smelled of lavender and fresh linen on the beds. Emma fell asleep instantly, exhausted by the day of trauma. Sophia sat by the window and watched the city lights. "I thought it was over," she whispered in the dark. I sat beside her and took her cold, thin hand. We were safe for now, but the house was still lost. The reality of Richard's crimes was deeper than we knew. My phone buzzed on the nightstand with a new alert. It was a message from Margaret at the law office. She had found a second mortgage on my own home. My breath caught in my throat as I read the line. Richard had used my personal data to forge a loan. He had tapped into my retirement to fund his Nevada exit. I realized then that I was also a victim of him. The hunter had been hunted since the very beginning. I walked to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. My reflection looked older and harder in the bright mirror. I had spent my life protecting others from this fraud. Now, I was standing in the middle of a ruins. I could not tell Sophia about the house just yet. She needed to believe that we had won the war today. I walked back to the bed and tucked her in. My mind was already planning the next tactical move. The next morning, I met James in the hotel lobby. He looked tired and had dark circles under his eyes. Richard didn't make it to Nevada, he told me quietly. The police had stopped the black sedan near the border. They found the suitcase full of cash and the fake ID. Richard was currently sitting in a holding cell in Barstow. He was facing multiple felony counts of fraud and grand theft. The coward had finally run out of road and luck. James handed me a small, encrypted thumb drive from his pocket. This was in his duffel bag. James said with a frown. It contained the contact info for a professional child broker. Richard was not just planning to flee with the mistress alone. He had been negotiating to sell his own daughter for cash to traffickers. I felt a wave of nausea wash over my entire body. The danger was far worse than a simple custody dispute. I looked up and saw Diane entering the lobby. I stood my ground as Diane marched across the marble lobby. She looked frantic, her fake pearls swinging wildly with every step. "You ruined him," she hissed, her voice a dry rattle. I did not move an inch as James stepped between us. I thought about the thumb drive and the child broker data. My hand tightened around my purse strap until my knuckles turned white. Diane was not here to fight for Richard. She was here because the money had finally stopped. "Richard is in jail, Diane," I said with a flat, final tone. Her face paled as the news hit her like a physical blow. She realized the police had intercepted the Nevada flight. I told her the secondary mortgage on my home was already being flagged. The fraud was so deep it had swallowed the entire family tree. She tried to turn away, but the lobby doors opened wide. 2 detectives in tan coats stepped inside with silver handcuffs out. They were not here for me. The officers grabbed Diane by her thin, shaking arms. They read her rights over the soft lobby music. It turned out she was the primary signatory on the offshore accounts. Richard had been her puppet, but she held the strings. I watched them lead her away past the golden luggage carts. Sophia and Emma appeared at the top of the stairs, watching the arrest. The cycle of control was finally shattered into pieces. A heavy silence fell over the Grand Hotel. 6 months later, the oak tree on Maple Street stood tall. We had scrubbed the house clean of Richard's lingering filth. The criminal tenants were evicted after the police raid. Once the forensic teams cleared the crime scene, we scrubbed the rooms and painted the walls soft blue. Sophia sat on the porch, her weight finally back to normal. She looked at her daughter playing in the green grass. The sunlight caught the princess crown Emma wore every single day. We were no longer counting coins in the dark. Life had returned to our quiet suburban street. I handed Sophia a cup of tea and sat down. We did not talk about the trials or the prison terms. We spoke about Emma's new school and the summer garden. My own home was safe after months of grueling litigation. I had retired for real this time, leaving the law behind. The folder of evidence was replaced by a book of fairy tales. Sophia leaned her head on my shoulder and sighed. We had survived the long winter of their greed. The sun began to set behind the neighboring rooftops. Emma ran to us with a handful of yellow dandelions. She looked happy, her eyes bright and full of easy joy. I realized that family was about the people who showed up. We were the ones who fought when the world turned cold. Sophia kissed the top of my head and laughed softly. It was a beautiful, clear evening in our new world. As the sun set, a familiar car pulled up to the curb. It was James, dropping off the final legal documents that closed the case forever. I looked at the restored SUV in the driveway, a symbol of everything we had clawed back. We were finally whole.